This week's parsha is a very packed parsha with a lot of mitzvahs in it. One of the lesser discussed mitzvahs is the pasuk V'haya machanecha kadosh. Your camp should be holy. It is from this pasuk, perhaps also other psukim, whole discussion of itself, that we learn the prohibition of davening in a place that is not appropriate to daven in. For example, if there's bad smells and the like. Many, many halachas about this. Most people aren't interested in the topic. However, today we're going to be learning about some very relevant points regarding this topic and about having focus and concentration during davening kavanah or their lack of, and many leniencies, potential leniencies associated with this. Rav Shimshon Pincus Atzal has a very insightful and controversial piece on this, a small piece with certain ideas which are questionable. And we'll just point out the questions. In the Tifer Shimshon, on pages Reish Mem Vav to Reish Mem Zayin, he begins by quoting a Gemara in Brachos on Chav Beis, and this is part of a Gemara, actually. The Gemara says, the person daven, and then afterwards he realized that there was feces over there in that location. So the Gemara says, you have to go back and daven again. And the Gemara over there continues, goes into it more. Taisvus over there says, at least one of the Taisvus on that topic, and that Gemara says that this is specifically referring to a location that it was assumed that it was a doubtful location. There could have been excrement over there could have been feces, and therefore, that's the story. That you would have to go back. However, if it was in a location, you didn't need to worry about it. It was assumed that there wouldn't be feces there. In a paisel as kriya shema v'esatfila, you would still fulfill your obligation of Shema and Shemona Esrei. Davening. You open up Torah Shulchan Aruch. You look into this more, and you go to the end of a very important siman related to these halachas. By the way, all of this is on RabbiBlan.com. We discussed at length these halachas of feces. You go to the end of Siman Ayin Vav. The Shulchan Aruch over there says that if it was Ein Hamako and Mirohu L'Istapek, the place there wasn't a doubt that there was going to be feces there. In Sodrach Lachser V'Likos, so you don't need to go back. You don't need to go back and daven again.
The human feces.
Yeah. Animal also depends on the animal, different halachas in that. We're not going to go into it now. Comes along Rabbi Pincus and explains a very interesting idea. We see from over here that the prohibition of feces, the Isser of Soa, isn't doesn't have to do with the actual object itself. This is a very controversial idea, but it's an interesting concept nonetheless. We see from this, because it's not so simple, that's why I say controversial. We see from this halacha, at the basic level, the shallow understanding at least, that it's not an intrinsic prohibition, that because there is feces there, therefore I'm not allowed to daven. For example, similar to, if you made a mistake and you didn't recite the words of Shema appropriately. In that case, if you didn't recite the words, you can't fulfill your obligation. However, when it comes to the feces, we see that that's not true. It's not an inyan of mitzias. It doesn't have to do with the actuality. We don't care about the facts. That if there's feces, it's a problem. If not, no. That's not what we say. The halacha is on the gavra. It's on the person. That we are obligated to be careful that our camp should be holy. And if we were careful about this, even if it wasn't holy, in actuality, the mitzias it wasn't kodesh. You don't need to worry about this, and you would still fulfill your obligation, even l'chachil. You fulfill your obligation at the highest level. It's a very interesting concept. From here, we should just add our own words over here. This is talking about over here. The Mishnah Brew over here says that if you had feces on your clothing after you davened, and you really knew it was there beforehand, you need to go back and daven again. That's going to be a problem. And by the way, this could also be a problem with if you stepped in animal poop and stuff. It could very well be an issue. A cat you could be more lenient with. The Mishnah Brew over here says. We're not going to go into all those specifics now, but nevertheless, you have to be careful with this. Just to go into one tangential shaila, which comes up, very, very relevant point over here, which is diapers. It's always a classic question. What's the discussion if a person made kiddush or something, and then afterwards his kid has a diaper? Does he need to go back or not? So the basic idea is from over here is that there are in fact leniencies that are brought down. I brought in just to quote in short because this is just one specific tangential shiloh that's too good to pass over. In the Dirshu Mishnah Brew on footnote 33, they say over here from the Shilos and Shuva Shevet Alevi Chilek Tessim and Reish Oz Beis. I didn't look up any of these sources. I'm assuming that they're accurate. You should look them up though, just to confirm that it's permissible. You don't need to worry that there was feces over there on the child, and even if there was, it's covered, and you don't need to worry about it that maybe it leaked out of the diaper because it's more of a problem if it's considered halachically exposed and uncovered. However, if you knew that there was a smell there beforehand, right? And so then you need to distance yourself minimally 8 feet away from where the smell stops. And that's also what the Shilas Chuvas Or Letzion says in Chelik Beis, Perek Vav Chuva Yudalid. And he says that if you know that there's feces, you're obligated to check beforehand that the smell doesn't reach you. However, Rav Eliyashiv, quoted in the Zosa Bracha Perek Tezayin, says that if there is a smell, a bad smell that's coming from the feces that is covered, you could just distance yourself from the place until you no longer smell it. But preferably, you shouldn't rely on this. You should be careful to clean it first. So, in other words, if you don't know if there was feces there beforehand, it seems like the general halacha will be that it's okay. But nevertheless, one should certainly be careful about this. You should definitely be careful to check the location before and everything like that. In the Sefer Yishai Yisrael, in the Shilas and Shuvas at the end of the Sefer, in Shaila Ayin, he says that this exact case, if there's no smell that's coming, Reb Chaim Kanevsky says since it's covered, it's permissible to say over there Dvarim Shebikdusha. You could even say Kiddush and everything. So the idea over here is that you have leniencies. There's what to rely on if you already say Kiddush or something with the feces over there. This is topic one. This is just the feces. There's a lot to discuss on feces. What's it?
So, no, you can't smell it. Let's say your wife was holding the baby.
And it's a problem. If someone could smell it, it's already an issue beforehand. That's for sure an issue. The question is if it happened after. Just to point out, these all the halachas that revolve around Soa, I'm telling you right now, it takes dozens of hours to learn. It's very long. There's a lot of simanim. This is just one specific point that we're coming upon based on what he says over here. But now let's go into a second point that he says over here.
Isn't this all
This
relative to someone's
continues.
isn't this all relative to someone's sense of smell too, or not? I mean, if you're the only person.
Could be, yes, very well could be. The second point that Shimshon Pincus Etzel makes is he says he heard in the name of the Chazon Ish, quoted by the Chazon Ish. This is what the Chazon Ish said regarding Tefillah B'tzibor and a minyan. You're davening Shemona Esrei in a minyan of people. He said it's assumed that there's no minyan there because most people aren't careful about having the proper focus and intent on the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. Furthermore, most people aren't careful to make sure that there's no soa on them, feces. This includes the very important topic, which very few people learn about properly because they're not interested in it, wiping oneself properly. These are halachas that if they're not done properly, person wouldn't even fulfill his obligation after the fact. But anyways, so that apparently was said in the name of the Chazon Ish. And therefore, the tefillah, the davening, the Shemona Esrei is invalid. It's psul. And therefore, most of the time, you think you're davening with a minyan, you're not. So he says that this idea from the Chazon Ish, we can't validate it completely. We don't know if it's 100% accurate. However, this is where it gets interesting. He wants to say that you could be malamid zchus, you could defend those who aren't careful with these two halachas. Very relevant and important halachas. Regarding having proper focus in davening, this says he already discussed this in his Sefer Tiferes Torah, the sugyas in Siman Beis. These halachas of having proper focus, having proper kavana, intention for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, is only regarding a person fulfilling his obligation. But it still certainly wouldn't be a bracha of atala. This point is on par with actually poskim, what they say. See, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, others. That if a person didn't have the proper focus during davening, guess what? You might have not fulfilled your obligation of davening, but what the brachas that you said were not in vain. They're not what we call brachas levatalos, blessings that were in vain, brachas that were in vain. And you didn't fulfill the obligation of davening properly, but it's a tefillah b'chefsa. Still counts as something. What's the proof? If a person knew that he didn't have kavanah, beginning of the Shemona Esrei, and he's towards the end, he could continue davening, which is in and of itself is a whole discussion. You know, we'll come back to this. If we're going to say that all the brachas that now he's going to say are in vain because he didn't have proper focus and kavanah on the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, all of the brachas are just invalid. They're in vain. They're for nothing. They're brachas of atalas. The Stipler discusses this in his Sefer Kihilas Yaakov. They quote it over here in Siman Chav Vav. It's a mistake. Siman Chav Zayin, and in particular, it's Os Aleph. We'll go through what the Stipler says momentarily. It's similar to a korban that was shaloi lishma. It was brought for the wrong intention, which the halach would be, it would still be kosher, would still be valid. So seemingly, it would apply regarding tefillah b'tzibor, davening in a congregation. There wouldn't be a chisaron. There wouldn't be something lacking. Because the mohos of tefillah b'tzibor, the essence of the Shemona Esrei, of the davening, is 10 people davening together. And if you didn't do it properly, nevertheless, you still have a chefs of tefillah. It's still tefillah b'tzibor. It still counts. Tefillah with, still considered davening with a group of people. Similarly, regarding passing in front of someone who's davening Shemona Esrei, we're not allowed to. It's a Gemara. It's brought down in Siman Kuf Beis for multiple reasons. You're going to disturb his concentration. You're going to separate him between him and Hashem. So let's say you know that someone was looking all over the place. He wasn't focused at all. He didn't have kavanah. Are you allowed to pass in front of him or not? No, because even though he's not fulfilling his obligation of davening, nevertheless, it still counts as a davening. It's still something, and therefore there's a shechina over there. Hashem is there, and you're not allowed to pass in front of him. Regarding the feces, it says a tremendous insight. Just like if a person made a mistake, and it turns out that there was feces in his location after where he was davening, and he didn't know about it, it wouldn't invalidate his davening. He wants to say a tremendous controversial insight over here. The same halacha would apply if a person made a mistake with the halacha. He wouldn't become invalid, even though it says in the fourth paragraph of Pirkei Avos, Mishnah Gimel Shkigos Talmud Olazadon. It says in Pirkei Avos that a mistake caused by not learning could count as that you did it on purpose. That's only klape shmaya. That's how heaven looks at it. However, when it comes to the whole Torah, someone who didn't learn, he's considered it was completely accidental. And then he concludes by saying, Yehira Atzon, it should be the will of Hashem, that these words will be accepted by all of the poskim of the generation, all of those who determine the halach of the generation, not to invalidate all of the tefillas, all of the Shemona Esreis that people daven, all of the brachos that people recite who don't know how to be careful with this. And then in his last point, he says, with this, we could ask a question by children. They're not clean properly. People are saying brachos with them, teaching them how to daven. It's all in vain. Based on what we said, it's not. Furthermore, even if a child learned about these halachos and he still wasn't careful, could still be fine. Still be fine. He's not commanded on this. He's a child. Button didn't sin. That's a Shimshon Pincus. That's how tremendous leniencies attached to this. Let's begin by speaking out what the Kehilas Yaakov, the Stipler, writes about in Brachos over there that he quoted briefly and said Ayin Sham. What's the Gemara in Brachos Lamed Dalet? Says that if a person was davening, he needs to have kavanah by all the brachos. When he davens, sorry about that. When he davens, he needs to have focus. He needs to have intent. And if he can't have focus on all of the brachos, minimally, you should have focus and intention on one of the brachos. We're going to see what this intention exactly is over here. For the beginning. In other words, we see that if a person didn't have the proper focus for the beginning bracha of Shemona Esrei, you wouldn't even fill his obligation. So the question is, let's say a person remembered in the middle of he was davening, he didn't have kavanah. How could he continue davening if he's not fulfilling his obligation? It's all in vain. The Ber Halacha asked this question. Come back to that Ber Halacha. You need to say that even though if you didn't have kavanah, you need to go back and daven again, it still wouldn't be that the brachos would be in vain, like we said. It's still called a davening. Just it's lacking the kavanah, the proper intention, the proper focus. And therefore, you need to return and daven again in order to fulfill this idea of having proper focus, proper kavanah. But it's still considered a tefillah. Gambaloi kavanah yikinyan tefillah. Ba'amir ba'al. It's still considered a Shemona Esrei. It's not like a bracha l'batal. In the footnote, he says, I saw this that the Mabit says this explicitly in two of his farm. The nafkamina, the difference would be if you cannot have any focus whatsoever. You tried having focus, and we're going to come back to focus, and you couldn't have focus at all. You should still daven. It's still a mitzvah, just you don't have the kavanah. But if you are able to focus again, you should go back. The question is, where does this concept come? They can still count even without kavanah. Where does that concept come from? That's already a question that the Stipler himself asked. Then he says he found in the Rokeach, who says that if you cannot have kavanah for all the brachos of Shemona Esrei, at least have kavanah for the beginning of Shemona Esrei or modim. That's what the Rokeach says. Or modim.
Now we're talking about that you didn't hit kavanah even by the first bracha.
Yeah.
Going on, even if you didn't hit by the first bracha.
That's right.
This is also.
That's right. That's right. It still counts as an davening. Still counts. Comes along the Rokeach and says you can't have kavanah for the whole thing. At least do it for the first bracha or modim. Says the Stipler, according to this text of this idea of the Rokeach, if a person didn't have kavanah, he didn't have proper focus in the beginning of Shemona Esrei, make sure you have it for modim. You would still fulfill your obligation. He goes into it a little bit more and he says that you see from over here, someone who didn't have proper focus and intent for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei should be very careful to have proper focus and intent during the bracha of Modim to fulfill this rokeach, what the rokeach says. And you have to be very, very careful with this, says the Stipler.
Mm.
The Stipler says.
Kavana meaning every word.
Let's discuss Kavanah now. What is Kavanah? Didn't really explain what it was yet on purpose. The Shulchan Aruch says you need to have Kavanah in Siman Kuf Aleph. What does this mean? The Mishnah Brew over here explains. Peirish Amilas. You have to understand the words that you're saying and put focus into those words. Intent. Mean what you're saying with your heart. Don't just say the words. You have to really mean it. This is one of the few places in the whole davening when you have to mean what you say. And if you don't, then you have major halachic issues, as we're discussing right now. And therefore, continues the Mishnah Brew, it's very correct that the regular people who don't understand davening should make sure to study davening so that they can understand Shemona Esrei. Minimally, the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, Modim. There's an obligation to understand what you're saying so that you could have the kavanah. How could you mean what you say if you don't understand it? Shulchan Aruch continues, if you're not able to have intent for all of them, minimally, first bracha. Avos, it's called. Then the Mishnah Berurah quotes, there's some poskim who hold that modim is considered like the avos lechatchila. The Sha'ar Tzion Gimel, he says the smack says that b'diavad modim is not as strong as avos, but still we see that was the rokeach that we just saw quoted. So you should be careful. And then the Mishnah Berurah says at the end of Gimel, and if you estimate that you cannot have the proper focus for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, don't daven until Achatis Daisa. Don't daven until you're able to settle your mind and have proper focus for the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. That's if you're able to focus. Stipler was talking about before, you're not able to focus at all. You should still daven, he said. Comes along the Rama. Pretty known idea. Quotes the Torah. The ha'idno ein choyzun b'shvil chesun kavana. Says the Rama, nowadays, says the Torah, if you didn't have the proper focus and intent, you would not need to go back again. Why? Sha'af b'chazora koravu shelo yichavinim kein lama yachsur. To assume when you go back, you're also not going to have the proper focus and intent. So what on earth is the point of you going back? You're going back again to not have any focus. What's the point of that? It's pointless. The Mishnah Berurah over here says, if you remembered before you concluded this bracha, before you said Brachat Hashem Magen Avraham, was before you said Brachat Hashem, you realize you didn't have kavanah. Go back to the beginning. Go back to, Elokei Avraham, says the Mishnah Berurah. Go back to Elokei Avraham, the Mishnah Berurah says. So this is where the Be'er Halach is bothered by, and this is what Rabbi Pincus was quoting, the Stipler was quoting, that if you didn't have proper focus, what's the point of continuing to go on? And the Be'er Halach goes through it, and he basically says that's why if you know you didn't have kavanah, wait until the Chazan starts Chazar Sashatz, listen to him, Shemea Ka'ona, listening is like answering, and have focus, and then continue on your own with Shemona Esrei. This is a well-known Be'er Halach over here. Seems like you would listen to the Chazan even the whole way through.
The whole way through?
The whole way through. Oh, then after you could begin on your own. Okay. You could begin on your own. Okay. You could begin on your own. Others say completely different than this. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says in the Halicha Shlomo Periches Os Tes, if you know that you didn't have kavanah and you realize in the middle of davening, so you need to go back, technically speaking.
You just said you
He talks about over here, since technically speaking, Medina, before the Ramah, before the Torah, you would need to go back. Technically speaking, What you should do is they say in the name of the Chazon Ish, think about the bracha, the first bracha, think about every single word, the text, until where you're up to,
Wow.
and then you continue. That's what's said over in the name of the Chazon Ish. So you see how serious this, in fact, is. This idea of having kavanah. This is the Ber Halach over here. A few other very interesting, relevant points to this, and there's a lot more to go into. We discussed this original recording, jobbadlan.com, at length. These are just two ideas, two basic ideas, just to pull out of here. This is something that we need to be very careful with, very, very careful. Reb Chaim Kanievsky also likes this approach of the Chazon Ish. He already said, Baruch Atah Hashem. He was asked if he should say, Lamdeni Chukacha. According to the Chazon Ish, you think about it. That's at the end of the Yishay Yisrael. The Shalos and Shuvas and Shaila Kuf Beis.
So you don't do Lamdeni Hukaf.
Correct. That's according to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. You got to be careful with this at the end of the day. Let's say a Chazan didn't have Kavanah. So he wants to say, you continue your davening, he'll fulfill his obligation with Chazar Sashatz and Chaim Kanievsky potentially. Look, at the end of the day, we have to be very careful with everything that we just discussed. We see how serious this is, and you have to be very cautious about this. There's a lot more to discuss on this topic. Tremendous, a lot more. This is a very long topic in Sugya. Kind of cool. Running out of time, and that's what I was worried of. The Shalos and Shuvas Eretz Tzvi, Siman Chav Beis, he discusses multiple reasons why perhaps one could be lenient if he didn't have intent when he was davening with other people. Reason number one is if you have just kavanah at the end of the bracha, maybe that could help. If you just have kavanah, intention, at the end of the bracha. Explanation number two, based on a chinuch and mitzvah taflam and gimel. You have to know who you're standing in front of. It's also based on a brisker Rav on the Rambam. If you know that you're standing in front of Hashem, potentially then you could be fine. And he says there's a basis for this also from the Shiboli Haleket and Siman Yud Zayin. If a person was davening without kavanah, he could still fulfill his obligation just like a korban. Stama l'shma kai, we assume that it was good. And that's reason two. Explanation number three, you could bank on what the Chazan says, fill your obligation with him, which is kind of what we discussed. And therefore, someone who didn't have proper intent in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, you should bank on what the Chazan says. Wouldn't say bracha b'ruch Shemo, of course. And he says a lot of people don't have proper focus. Quotes the Ramah, Tosfos at the by Shema also Chosim, room Shema. That's why he would still do it. Whole discussion on that. How could you continue davening if you know you didn't have focus? Siach Hasoda in Siman Ches answers that question. He discusses that. I had a mental note I was going to look up the Siach Soda. I never got around to it though. This is a lot over here to put together, as you could tell. But I had a mental note to look that up. That's an interesting discussion. So it's difficult to say that most Jews aren't fulfilling their obligation just because they don't have proper intention. It'll be based on a Tosfos. Rosh Hashanah, Lamed Daled, Lamed Beis, Brachos, Lamed Gimel, Lamed Beis. not going to be worse than forgetting Ya'alev Yavo on Rosh Chodesh during the day. Basically wants to say it could be like Am Shebesodis. Is basically one, right? Just like if you forgot Ya'alev Yavo, the Chazan could fulfill your obligation on Rosh Chodesh, so too over here the Chazan could cover you, right? And you're considered, yeah, typically, but in this case, it wouldn't be worse than Am Shebesodis. By duchening, we say if someone can't go to shul, they're still going to fulfill their obligations, and so too over here if they can't do it. Since most people don't have the proper intention that they should. So what's going on over here? Rather, you have to come on to this explanation. Nowadays, we don't fulfill our obligation with the chazan because it's difficult to focus that long. But over here, right, there's no other way. It's considered Ein lecha anisi v'tridi gadol mazeh. We're completely burdened. So we're considered like Amsha Besadus, like the people in the field, to fulfill their obligation. Even without hearing, so to us. That's basically what he says in short. This is from Lublin, the head of the yeshiva of Lublin, Rabbi Sri Fromers. Sure. So that's what he says over here. And that's reason number 3. Reason number 4, we're really running out of time, but Taisvus in Psachim Kuf Tes Vav, Egli Tal, says it's still considered a mitzvah even without intention. You know you can't have any intention at all, you still do it without having proper intention. Probably not going to do it again if you go back like we saw in the Ramah. Better to daven without having proper focus than not to daven at all, like we saw before. Shiboli Aleket also supports this idea. It's another interesting thing. Any zevach, korban, sacrifice that was brought shalol lishma, it's kosher. Just it doesn't count for the owner as a chova, as an obligation. So that could be a basis over here as well. Could still count as something. So therefore, you should daven even though you know you're not going to have the proper focus, and even lechachilu you're allowed to daven. Even preferably you're allowed to daven, even though you're not going to have proper focus. So since the actual Shemona Esrei counts, it's anywhere, someone anywhere in the world who had kavana, it could be like it's attaching to your Shemona Esrei, and it's like Am Shebesados, the people in the field, you're still going to fulfill your obligation. Last reason he says, reason 5, new idea, based on a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah also, provides another reason. Running out of time, so we're just going to skip this one, but it is like a 5th reason that he gives. One last point that he says at the end is that this is why it's so important nowadays to daven with a group, with the tzibur, more than the time of the Gemara. Right? We're not experts nowadays, and we don't fulfill our obligation with the chazan typically. But the Gemara in Tainis Avches, also Zohar, explains that if a person davens without proper focus and it's with a group, it will be accepted, unlike an individual. So since according to the Gemara, we see that you need to have proper focus, it's just that we're not able to, so what's the point of even going back like we saw before? We have to do all the tactics that we could that now our tefillas will be accepted, aka davening with a group. We could do that, and that's an obligation to do. Chiyav gamor aleinu, noisef al chiyav tefillah b'tzibur. So now we have an additional reason to daven with a group. So don't learn from these righteous people who daven by themselves, because they for sure were able to have proper intent, as is discussed in Siman Sadiches Sif Aleph. We're not able to do that. It's another reason to daven with the tzibur. Rabbi Galinsky in Parshas Be'eschanan, in Parshas Sav, excuse me, on beginning of Pasuk Vav, relates that the Noda Yehuda stood up to speak Shabbos Shuvah, and he said, be very careful with praying with a group of people, with a minyan, and not alone. Because none of us could say that all of our Every time we daven, we have proper intention. But the davening is instead of a korban. And therefore, if we don't have proper focus, it's like a flawed animal that was brought as an offering. No good. And the halacha is, if it was brought up, it doesn't descend, it doesn't get accepted. But this is referring to if it became invalid after it was brought into the sanctuary. In other words, if his flawed prayer was said in the sanctuary in shul, it will be accepted. But if it's alone, then the same flawed prayer will be rejected. That's the idea. Excuse me. We have to be careful thoughts that go into our minds that we shouldn't be thinking about. We have to be very careful. This is, by the way, Ramosha Feinstein, also in the Shel Shuvah Sigris Moshe Chila Gimel Simin Zayin, writes that this is why we have to daven with the tzibor, like we just did with the congregation, with the group, even more than the past, as we just discussed in the Eretz Tzvi also. Be'er halacha. Okay, that was the be'er halacha that we just saw, and this is the idea over here. This is why vidui. One explanation. All right, we'll skip the video because we only have 2 minutes. But this is the idea. Someone went to the cuts. Okay, we really have very little idea. This is the idea. One time the rabbi said, "Oh, Shalom Aleichem after davening." What do you mean, Shalom Aleichem? He said, "Oh, you went on a trip during davening. Your mind was all over the place." Eila brach of Eila besusim. That other nations they go with the chariots and with the horses. That if they want to go somewhere, they got to travel by vehicle. V'anachnu b'shem Hashem Elokeinu nazkir. We just have to mention Hashem's name. We already start spacing out, thinking about anything. We're traveling. There was once a Jew who was renting from one of the noblemen, and he hasn't paid for 3 years. Finally, the nobleman came over, and you have to pay up the rent and everything. And he had on one side of the ledger, it was all of the expenses. The other side was everything that he owed him, because the Jew also gave him some food and other things, and he mixed the things, and he got upset, threw it into the fire, and then quickly he took it. And then he threw it into the fire. And he said, "Oh, I messed up. Get out of here. I owe you money." So he asked one of the rabbis, "Do I need to pay him back? Is he going to find out?" Whatever. He said, "No, don't worry. He doesn't daven Shemona Esrei. He won't think about it." We have to be careful. That's the unfortunate reality. What are we thinking about the whole time, right?
Yeah.
We don't have time to quote the rest of it, but this is the idea. We have to make sure to have proper focus, the proper kavanah during davening. Something that's not a joke. But at the end of the day, we have a lot to rely on. But in the general halakha, it seems it's not